There is one question I get asked over and over again. And if you have an orchid at home, chances are you have asked yourself the same thing. Why does my orchid have big, green, healthy leaves, but it never grows a new flower spike? And that is exactly what makes this plant so fascinating. Your orchid doesn't look sick, it doesn't suddenly dry out, it doesn't lose all its leaves overnight. It simply keeps growing, but it stops blooming. Sometimes an entire year can pass without a single flower appearing. That's when the doubts begin. You move the orchid to a different spot. You try giving it more light, then maybe less light. You water it more often. Then you start worrying that you're watering too much and almost stop completely. You buy a fertilizer that promises incredible blooms and wait for that magical moment when your orchid finally comes back to life. But the weeks go by and your orchid remains just as beautiful, just as green, and completely silent. The surprising thing is that in many cases, the real problem is not where most people think it is. And once you discover what is actually holding your orchid back, many things start to make sense. The hidden detail, the growing medium. Before talking about fertilizers or any homemade remedy, there is one detail that can be canceling out everything you are doing right: the growing medium. Orchids do not grow in regular soil like most houseplants. Their roots need oxygen just as much as they need moisture. Over time, the bark inside the pot begins to break down, becomes compacted, and loses those tiny spaces where air can circulate. From the outside, everything may look perfectly fine. But underneath the surface, the roots may slowly start struggling more and more.
When a root cannot breathe properly, it also becomes less effective at absorbing water and nutrients. Under those conditions, the plant usually focuses all of its energy on staying alive rather than producing a new flower spike. That is why no fertilizer can perform miracles if the roots are not healthy enough to absorb and use it. The good news is that if your growing medium still allows good airflow and the roots look firm, green when they are wet, or silvery when they are dry, then you have already solved a big part of the problem. And now we can talk about one of the most well-known tips among experienced orchid growers:
the revelation. An ingredient you probably already have at home. The first time I heard this advice, I honestly thought it was too simple to actually make a difference. The ingredient behind this trick is something you probably already have in your kitchen, something we usually associate with desserts, tea, or coffee: cinnamon. That small jar that can sit forgotten in your pantry for months may also have a place in orchid care. Cinnamon contains natural compounds, such as cinnamaldehyde, which have been studied for their antifungal and antibacterial properties. That is why many orchid growers have used cinnamon for years to help protect damaged areas, such as root cuts or rhizomes, after pruning or repotting. But it is important to understand something. Cinnamon is not a fertilizer, and it is not a product that will make an orchid bloom by itself.
Its real value comes from helping create a healthier environment around the roots, especially when the plant is recovering from stress. And this is where a detail that many people never mention becomes extremely important. The way you apply cinnamon can make the difference between seeing a benefit or seeing absolutely no change at all.
How cinnamon works in orchid growing medium. When cinnamon comes into contact with the moist growing medium of an orchid, something interesting happens. It does not replace proper orchid care, and it will not make a plant bloom like magic. But when used correctly, it can become a helpful ally. One of its main benefits is helping maintain a cleaner environment around the roots. Thanks to natural compounds like cinnamaldehyde, cinnamon may help discourage the growth of certain fungi and microorganisms that take advantage of constant moisture inside the growing medium. And although we usually cannot see them, these problems can slowly weaken the roots and force the orchid to spend its energy recovering instead of producing a new flower spike. There is a second benefit that explains why so many orchid growers always keep cinnamon nearby. After removing a damaged root or dividing a plant, many growers apply a small amount of cinnamon to the affected area. It helps keep the cut dry and may reduce the chances of problems developing during those first few days when the plant is especially vulnerable. And there is a third detail that often goes unnoticed. An orchid with healthy, well-oxygenated roots and fewer root problems has a much better chance of responding positively to the right conditions of light, temperature, and nutrition. Cinnamon does not force an orchid to bloom. What it can do is help create an environment where the plant is able to focus its energy on growing again.
And when the right conditions arrive, begin the process of producing new flowers.
The wisdom of previous generations. There is something that has always fascinated me. Long before scientists studied natural compounds or soil microorganisms, many people were already using cinnamon on their houseplants. Every time they repotted a plant or removed a damaged root, they would sprinkle a small amount of cinnamon and repeat the same simple phrase. It helps keep it from rotting. They did not know the name cinnamaldehyde or understand exactly how these compounds worked. They simply observed the results and passed that knowledge from one generation to the next. It was practical gardening wisdom shared from backyard to backyard, from balcony to balcony, long before science began explaining why these traditional methods sometimes worked. Today, we understand much more about the reasons behind those old techniques, and that makes this simple piece of gardening advice even more fascinating. A discovery that taught me an important lesson. Some time ago, I was checking several of my orchids after repotting them. While I was applying a small amount of cinnamon to one of them, a little bit accidentally fell into another orchid pot sitting nearby. I didn't think much of it. But a few weeks later, that second orchid showed a surprising recovery. Was it only because of the cinnamon? I honestly can't say for sure. That orchid was also receiving good light, it had healthy roots, and it was entering a period when growth conditions were becoming more favorable. But that experience taught me something I have never forgotten. When it comes to cinnamon, less is usually more. Using too much can dry out delicate roots and create the opposite effect of what we are trying to achieve. A very light application, however, is often enough to take advantage of its potential benefits without putting unnecessary stress on the plant. Step by step, how to use cinnamon correctly. Now, let's look at the right way to use it. Step 1. The amount. Take only a tiny pinch of cinnamon powder. With orchids, it is always better to be cautious because their roots are much more delicate than those of many other plants. Step 2. The application. Sprinkle a very small amount only on the surface of the growing medium or on a fresh cut after removing a damaged root during pruning or repotting. Avoid letting cinnamon build up around the crown of the orchid, on the leaves, or on healthy aerial roots. Step 3. Watering. If you applied cinnamon to the growing medium, simply wait until your next regular watering. The moisture will naturally help distribute it through the upper layers of the bark. There is no need to prepare special mixtures or solutions. A small amount, used at the right moment, is usually more than enough. And before you try this method, there are 3 important details that can make the difference between getting good results or making a mistake that many people repeat without realizing it. The 3 details that make all the difference. There are 3 important details that can determine whether you actually benefit from using cinnamon or end up thinking it doesn't work at all. Detail 1. Never apply cinnamon on healthy aerial roots. The roots that grow outside the orchid pot have an important purpose. They absorb moisture from the air and also participate in photosynthesis. If they look healthy, green, or silvery and feel firm to the touch, the best thing you can do is leave them alone. Cinnamon should only be used on fresh cuts or lightly on the surface of the growing medium. Do it when the bark is slightly moist, not completely soaked, and not completely dry. This allows the cinnamon to distribute more naturally through the upper layers, where moisture tends to remain longer and where some fungal problems can develop. Detail 3. Avoid sudden changes after treatment. Many people apply a treatment and then, on the same day, move the orchid to a different location, change their watering routine, or expose it to more sunlight because they want faster results. But with orchids, the opposite often happens. After repotting, pruning, or applying cinnamon, the best approach is to keep the plant in a place with bright, indirect light, good airflow, and the same care routine it was already used to. For orchids, stability is often much more helpful than constant changes. And now comes the question everyone wants to know. When will you start seeing results? The first thing you need to understand is that orchids have their own rhythm. Some orchids respond quickly, while others need several weeks or even a few months before showing visible changes. Everything depends on the orchid species, the time of year, and the overall condition of the plant. During the first few days, you probably won't notice any difference. The leaves often become firmer. Active roots regain their bright green color after watering, and new growth starts to become stronger. This is usually the first sign that your orchid is starting to function normally again. And then
comes the most exciting part. When the plant has stored enough energy and receives the right balance of light, temperature, and humidity, a small green tip may begin to appear from the center of the crown or between the upper leaves. At first, it can be easy to mistake it for a new root, but as it grows, it begins to take on the familiar shape of a flower spike.
Over the following weeks, that spike slowly grows longer and tiny flower buds begin to form. And finally comes the moment every orchid lover waits for. The buds begin to open one by one, never all at the same time. First one flower, then another, and then another. It is a slow process, but that is exactly what makes it so beautiful. After weeks or even months of patience, the orchid finally does what millions of people love it for. Filling your home with flowers that seem to last forever. And that is when you understand why orchids are known as plants of patience. They never rush. First, they strengthen their roots. Then they store energy. And only when they feel the conditions are right, they reward you with a bloom that can last for weeks. Now I want to ask you something. How long has it been since your orchid last bloomed? Tell me in the comments, and if you know the species of orchid you have, share that too. I'll be reading your comments and trying to help you discover what might be preventing your next flower spike from appearing. If you enjoy these types of plant care tips based on real experience, subscribe to the channel. Every week we share new gardening tricks, fascinating plant facts, and practical solutions to help your plants grow healthier and bloom beautifully. And if you know someone who has an orchid full of leaves but has been waiting months for a flower, share this video with them. Maybe today they will finally discover the answer they have been looking for. See you in the next video.